Well, baseball season is here. One of my favorite, yeah, thank you. One of my favorite times of year. I'm not an overly big basketball fan. I do enjoy the NCAA finals, but basketball in general. So there's always a time of the year when football ends and basketball begins, and it's like, I don't know what to do. But baseball season is here. And the funny thing about baseball, if you know about baseball players are notoriously superstitious about things they do. You know, it's if you get on a hitting streak, they may not change their undershirt or socks or something like that for games on end or that kind of thing. But there's a few guys that are just particularly quirky about their superstitions. There was a guy by the name of Wade Boggs that had a ritual that he ate chicken before a game every day. And so for 17 years before games, he would eat chicken. And he would always take 150 ground balls for practice, and he would always go into the batting cages exactly 5:17 when it had night games. These little quirky things he would do. There was another guy, Turk Wendell. He used to brush his teeth between innings. Somehow that was going to make him play better. And then Larry Walker was obsessed with the number 3. He wore 33. He would take 3 practice swings. He would set his alarm that would end in times that ended in 3. He would always do things in 3s. And that was his superstition. That was his way of performing better. Now, they seem quirky and amusing sometimes, but it's just kind of what baseball players did. But the interesting thing is the likelihood of these superstitions, whether you change your undershirt or not, or whether you take 3 practice swings or 5, probably isn't going to change the outcome of the game. It's probably not going to make you perform any better if you eat chicken or brush your teeth. Well, it's good to brush your teeth, but not between innings. We're beginning a new series today called The Road to Easter. And our first stop on the road to Easter is the Garden of Gethsemane. And when you look at Jesus' journey to the cross, if you really are honest and you think about the Garden of Gethsemane, it's like, does this stop really matter? From a purely logical standpoint, nothing changed after the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus still went to the cross. So what was the purpose of this stop in the garden? Why was Jesus spending time praying there? Why was this story in the Bible? Why was this scene of anguish and prayer included in what we are looking at? Like baseball superstitions, does this stop really matter? Because Jesus was facing something that he didn't want to do. But he submitted to God's will, God the Father, and he said, I'll do it anyway. And it poses an important question for us. How do we trust God? Can we trust God? Can we place our full trust in God? And how do we trust God when the outcomes that we expect and look like are going to happen are the exact things that we fear that might happen? What happens if it looks like God's will is something contrary than what we would rather do? How do we trust God has our well-being in mind? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the synoptic gospels, we call them, all include this story about Garden of Gethsemane. John, what did I say there? Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptics, include this story. John includes the story of the Garden of Gethsemane, but his is a little different twist. He looks at the arrest of Jesus as more than the anguish of prayer. But all 4 gospel writers felt compelled to include this story in their gospel account. So it leads us to believe there's something to be harvested, there's something to be learned, there's something to be gained by this story. Because just rituals alone, whether they be religious or baseball superstitions, aren't really going to make trust elevate. But when we say, God, my will is submitted to your will, that's an entirely different story. The text was read for us this morning, but I want to walk through it because it's an important text. Matthew 14, beginning at verse 32, it says, when they went to the place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to the disciples, sit here while I pray. And he took Peter, James, and John along with him and began to be deeply distressed and troubled. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. And he said to them, stay here, keep watch. Even if you're not sure about Christianity, even if you are just exploring faith and you aren't fully engaged in what this is going on here, here we have a story that's intensely human. A man facing deep fears, wrestling with a decision, feeling abandoned by his friends. A moment of crisis. Jesus is significant here because his fear of suffering, his fear and the struggle of placing his trust in God are real. Jesus is fully human and fully divine, and here his human side is coming out. And like any one of us is, I don't want to go through this pain. Who likes pain? None of us. We all resist pain. It's just natural. The loneliness, the devastation, it's a story of humanity that we can relate to. Jesus' emotions are really raw and vulnerable during this time. He says, my soul is overwhelmed to the point of death. Now, we sometimes overstate our emotions. I'm going to die, or I could just fall over, or something like that. And we don't really mean we're going to die. But Jesus here, his emotions are gripped by what is in front of him. That fully human and fully divine humanity walking through this process, but divine knowing what the God's will is merging together as one. Jesus sees the path that God is leading him to go on. He's even forecasted or predicted that in advance to his disciples. In his humanity, any one of us would want to say, get me out of here. I fear this. I don't want to do it. But Jesus' willing obedience and divine is moving towards it and ready to embrace it. So how do we trust God when he seems to be leading us into our greatest fears? How do we trust God when it seems like the circumstances are aligning that I don't want to do this, I don't want to encounter this, but this is what God's taking me to? Because sometimes God asks us to do hard tasks. Something very natural and normal is when we are called to share our faith. There's some that are just ready to do that on a moment's notice, but many of us, we have fear and trembling about sharing our faith. But God's asking us to do that on a regular basis, right? To share with others what is going on in our lives, what God has done for us, but we tend to fear it. So how do we overcome this? Knowing the intensity of this time, he stationed Peter, James, and John with them, and he says, stay here, keep watch. As we submit to God's will, we need others. We need the companionship of others. We need the community of faith around us. We need the support of other people. And Jesus, in his humanity side, needed the support of these three people, Peter, James, and John. He says, my soul is overwhelmed. He discloses his raw emotions to these three. And he says, stay here, keep watch. Watch. This watching was something very intense because it's like, well, what's watching going to do? What what would Peter, James, and John actually going to be doing? But this watching is a active kind of watching, an engaging kind of watching, a standing with Jesus in watching, a praying for one another. If you've ever been a helper and you've tried to help somebody else, it sometimes feels helpless, doesn't it? They're going through a difficult time and you say, what can I do for you? Nothing. Many of us have encountered somebody who has an illness or an illness that's leading to death. You know, it's clear the body is wasting away or whatever, and there's either a physical injury or an illness or a sickness, and you see the physical body deteriorating, and you sit with that person and you say, what can I do? And you feel helpless. But it's an amazing thing about our humanity. The presence of others makes a difference, doesn't it? Somebody just to sit with you and say nothing is sometimes comforting. Remember the story of Job? And he had those 3 friends that kind of tried to talk him out of being obedient to God. You know, sometimes I think his friends got a bad rap, but when you think about Job's friends, they spent a long time with Job, where they said, here's a guy going through a difficult time. And they said, I will sit with you for days. What incredible friends they were. Maybe they were kind of misguided, and the story of Job is for another day, but here we have 3 friends that just gave immense time. There's power in the presence of community. But the story goes on. Mark and the other gospel writers continue. Mark 14:35, going a little further, Jesus fell at the ground and prayed that, if possible, the hour might pass from him. Abba, Father, he said, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. These are incredibly powerful verses. Jesus fell to the ground and prayed. An immensely vulnerable time, revealing his inner heart. While he was showing his greatest weakness of saying, I just don't have the strength to do it, he was also demonstrating his greatest power by being submitted to God. Philippians 2, Paul writes that Jesus gave up his rights, set them aside in order to fulfill the will of the Father. This became the pathway to his glorification. He says, Abba, Father, everything is possible for you. It's deeply relational. This Abba is a very relational, very intimate kind of address to God. And he's declaring, I fully believe you, God, can do whatever you want. I declare the belief that this is what you can do. You can change the circumstances. You can bring about change here in this place. I fully believe that. And those changes, this situation may not be what I want them to be, but I will do your will. It's a profound tension. Everything is possible for you, God. A declaration of God's power, limitless power. John, in the book of John, Jesus' words are recorded saying that we can do things that are greater than himself, he tells us. That apart from Jesus, we can do nothing. That if we remain in him, ask whatever you want and it'll be given to you. And we stand in this same tension, that boundless understanding that God is the all-inspiring, powerful God, that he can create mountains, he can move hills, he can order all time and seasons however he wishes. That nothing is too difficult for him. But sometimes there's a gap between what we desire and what God desires. And we run into that tension. That gap is the place where trust is formed. That gap is where we experience, are we going to fully trust God for what he is and who he is? Or are we going to trust ourselves? Submitting isn't a passive alignment, isn't a passive way of saying that, whatever. But it's recognizing that God's wisdom far exceeds our understanding and our perspective. We face this challenge when we want to look at a path forward and we're not sure what to do. When we are called to make a sacrifice that we'd really rather not make. And sacrifices are just like that. They're sacrifices, right? You give something up. It's not just a flippant kind of thing. I am giving something up when we sacrifice. That is, by definition, what a sacrifice is. Jesus doesn't diminish God's power by submitting to his will. He actually says with full confidence, because you are the all-powerful God, you are the one I can place my trust in, now I submit to your wisdom. And Jesus doesn't pray a vague kind of prayer of just sort of kind of get me out of this, but he says specifically, take this cup away from me. Let it be removed. He names exactly what he wants. And true trust doesn't depend on our just pretending that we somehow don't have emotions and we aren't invested in what's going on. True trusting doesn't mean that we have to be strong and not give our complaints to God. Trusting is saying and laying all things out to God and saying, this is where I'm at. We can bring our raw desires to God with that confidence that God's purposes will prevail through our surrender. God's purposes will prevail as we surrender to him. Not my will, but your will. The story here continues. Mark 14:37. Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Simon, he said, Peter, are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for an hour? Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And once more, he went away and prayed the same thing. He came back. He found them asleep because their eyes were heavy, and they didn't know what to say to him. Returning a third time, he said, are you still sleeping and resting? Jesus just poured out his anguish to the Father. Take this cup away from me. Please, I don't want to do it. I don't want to go through this pain and suffering. But not my will, yours. He laid that all out. And then he returns only to find his companions sleeping. Imagine the contrast. Jesus came back, his face was probably full of torment. Maybe his tears were still on his cheeks, not quite dried yet. Maybe his hair was all kind of disheveled and pushed aside. And he found the disciples asleep. They were close. They were within just a stone's throw away. But the contrast couldn't be more immense. The desperate prayers of Jesus to almost painfully absent behavior of the disciples. The inability of the disciples to stay awake reveals something important about our human nature. This physical exhaustion of the disciples reveals more than just that they were tired, but a fundamental weakness that we have as humans. We cannot sustain ourselves on our own. We need a Savior. The disciples' inability to stay awake reveal and they point and they mirror something that we oftentimes have difficulties with as well. In our world today, it seems like we're in an age of distraction, right? There's always things vying for our attention. There's always billboards in front of us. There's always something to say, look at me, look at me, look at me. We're pulled in countless directions. The disciples' eyes were heavy. They were given to sleep. There were sacred moments around them, but they couldn't see it. They were distracted like we are today by scrolling on our phones, or distracted with the things that we have to do, or distracted with something else that's on our mind. And Jesus' words here, couldn't you watch with me 1 hour? Couldn't we put our phones away for just an hour as we talk with our family? Couldn't we give the full attention to our friend who is in a point of need? Couldn't we remain awake for the ordinary moments of God around us? But the disciples' failure actually gives us a gift. It may not seem like that, but they give us a gift here and recognize this story that Jesus offers this gentle rebuke and says, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. He acknowledges that and he understands our limitations, our fatigue, our failure, our avoidance mechanisms. Community is important. But it was, as mentioned earlier, Howard Hendricks once said that prayer is the recognition that our need is not partial, it's total. Prayer acknowledges that our need is not partial, but it's total. By nature, prayer is surrender. Prayer is saying, I come to you, God. And I wonder if that's why prayer is so hard sometimes. We just finished a series on prayer, and almost universally, people say, yeah, I believe in prayer, I should pray more, but I struggle to pray. But prayer is that surrender that says, I need more. I need a Savior. I can't do it myself. We can't do this on our own. We need a Savior. Now, imagine, if you would, for just a moment, what had happened if Jesus went to the garden and prayed, I'm not going to do it. It's too hard. Forget it. What if he chose his own comfort over the Father's will? What if Jesus would have exercised his divine prerogative and said, okay, great. I'm calling on legions of angels right now, and I'm going to put a stop to all this foolishness right now. We're just going to overpower the Romans. We're going to force you all into submission. We're going to make it happen. What if Jesus would have done that? What if his cup would have remained full? What if the debt would have remained unpaid? What if the chasm between humanity and God were never bridged? What if Jesus said, forget it. God's given me this power. I'm going to exercise it. In the garden, there remained in a balance salvation. The balance, the salvation was right there, teetering on the edge. God or Jesus could have used his divine prerogative to escape this, to get away from it. But we were waiting for his answer. But Jesus didn't do that at Gethsemane. Jesus didn't take on his own power, exercise what he wanted to do. Instead, he sweat drops of blood. He embraced the unthinkable, and he said, I'll do it. Not my will, but your will. And history began to turn. Because of what Jesus did in the garden, we can experience forgiveness at the cross. Because he chose God's will over his comfort, we can know the reconciliation of God. Because he drank the cup of judgment, we can drink the cup of salvation. And this wonder, it's a wonder what Jesus did for us in this moment of greatest temptation when his humanity wanted to turn tail and run. He wanted to escape. He wanted to get out there as fast as possible. He chose love for us. Instead of escaping the plan, the path that was before him, he surrendered, he submitted to the will of God, and he said, I'll do it. And he did it for us. The pathway in the garden shows us that salvation wasn't automatic. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't just going to happen. It was chosen. It was deliberate. It was painful. It was loving. The sweat of blood that came in at Gethsemane and the drops of blood that came from Calvary, Jesus was saying, this is for you. This is for you. I choose to do this. Baseball superstitions may be quirky and kind of meaningless rituals. But the Garden of Gethsemane was not. It changed the course of history. It wasn't just a religious ritual or an empty tradition. It's when divine love overcame human fear. When trust triumphed over terror, and when surrender paved the path to victory. When we face times of surrender, when we face times when we are looking down the road and saying, I don't want to do this, Jesus showed us a path that says, submit to the will of God the Father, and he will give you life. Perhaps the one way that we could apply this, how do we take this idea of, yeah, I get it, but how do we take the idea of applying trust into our lives? One area is to identify one specific area in your life where maybe you're struggling to trust, or something is in front of you that's a difficult situation that you need to encounter. Maybe it's a difficult conversation. Maybe it's something you've been avoiding for months. Maybe it's a task. Maybe it's something you feel unqualified about. Maybe it's some area that somebody hurt you, or some boundary that was gone over, or some something that is there. We all have something that we want to avoid. One thing we can do is think about what's one concrete step we can make towards moving towards obedience in that area. What's God calling you to do? What's one step you can do? You don't have to do the whole thing, but what's one step? It's like a muscle. You exercise that and you begin to move it forward. There's momentum, and you begin to take one step and leads to another. Because remember, Jesus's anguish wasn't in one big swoop. He fell, he prayed, he returned to the disciples, he came back and he prayed again, he went back and he prayed again. But as we take that one step, we begin to live out our trust. As we prepare our hearts for Easter, Easter is just 2 weeks away. Always seems to sneak up on us, doesn't it? Gethsemane stands as a sacred stop on our road to Easter. It's a pivotal moment that changes everything. A time when Jesus could have said, nope, not going to do it. But instead chose and said, yes, I will do your will. And because Jesus said, not my will, but yours in the garden, we can face our own moments of surrender with confidence. That the path might not be easy. The path may not be glorious. The path may have some difficulty. But Jesus has already walked that path and demonstrated that God is loving and trustworthy. And he will lead us according to his perfect purposes and plans. And this just isn't an ancient story. It's part of our story. Part of our path, part of our journey to experience the fullness and the complete love of God. Let's pray.